Suncoast is an okay film. I think it does a good job of tackling a really important topic, but the narrative itself is not very good. This was released in 2024. It's written and directed by Laura Chin, and it stars Nico Parker as Doris, Laura Linney as Kristine, and Woody Harrelson as Paul. And I'll talk more about the narrative in a moment. There won't be any spoilers for this. I won't give anything in any spoiler detail. But this is semi-autobiographical about Laura Chin's own experience growing up, and that part of it led me to doing a little bit of reading about this before I watched the film. I don't usually do that when it comes to films. I tend to go in with no information, but with this one, when I realised it was semi-autobiographical, I wanted to find out just a little bit more before I started watching it, and I'm glad that I did, because it did an absolutely terrible job of explaining the case of Terri Schiavo. If you don't know anything about this, basically, she was a woman who was admitted to the hospice of Florida's Suncoast, and this is in the 2000s. And basically, there was a fight between various people about whether she should have her feeding tube kept in or if they should take her feeding tube out. And it kept going back and forth, and it went to the courts, and there were different rulings. And basically, it's all about somebody's right to die and whether or not it's the right thing to remove that feeding tube and allow them to pass on when it's clear that there's not going to be any improvement. That's obviously a really important topic, and I'm pleased that the film introduced me to this case because I wasn't aware of the case of Terri Schiavo, but the film did a terrible job of explaining it. So had I not had any background reading beforehand, I would have been so confused about it, and honestly, it's completely irrelevant to the story. It does on one occasion allow us to very briefly discuss the morals and what's right and wrong when it comes to withdrawing that kind of support. But it's completely irrelevant to the main narrative, and because it wasn't explained very well in the film, it shouldn't have been in there. It was definitely padding. It did allow our protagonist to meet a certain character, and I'll talk about them in a moment, but I just don't think the narrative here was handled very well, and I don't think the main story was handled well either. The messages and the sentiment, yes, but the specifics of the narrative were incredibly boring and I don't think worked very well. So there are some good bits, but there are also some bits that don't work well at all. This is about our protagonist, Doris, and Doris's mother is spending all day, every day, with her son, who is in hospice care. He can no longer talk, he can't move. It's very clearly near the end of his life, and the film is all about how Doris deals with this while also trying to be a typical teenager and live her life, and also dealing with the fact that her mother has clearly forgotten she has another child. And I think that that's a really important topic. I think that unfortunately it's probably quite a common situation. If you have one child who is near the end of their life, I can understand why you'd want to spend every second with them, but it should never be at the expense of your living child or your other child. And we hear stories of this all the time where somebody's child is either unwell or they've passed on, and suddenly that becomes the parent's world and the other child or other children are completely neglected, and this is what we have here. However, I found the scenes away from the hospice to be so boring. Maybe I'm just not the right age. It is a coming of age film, and they are usually aimed at people of a similar age, and I'm no longer that age. So maybe if I were younger, I'd enjoy it more, but I found the scenes with Doris and her friends, the parties, they were just so boring, and it was unnecessary padding. It didn't need to be in there. It took us away from the main narrative, and that meant that whenever things had a chance to be emotional in the main narrative, we got pulled away from that before it had any chance to gain any momentum. So I feel like the messages are great. The topic is very well handled in that regard, but the padding in the narrative is very poorly done. And I really did not enjoy it. So I'd say I liked maybe less than 50% of this film. It tried hard, and I think the narrative is just not well represented. However, if somebody of a similar age to Doris wants to tell me that actually it's amazing and fantastic and they loved every second of it, I'm willing to accept that. But for me, at my 30-something age, looking for a film, well, I didn't seek it out intentionally, but I decided to watch this because it sounded like it was tackling a really important topic. And when it does tackle that topic, the topic of end of life, then I think it does it well. It does a really good job with it. It's just all the fluff and padding around that I just think was unnecessary. We could still get Doris's perspective as a teenager without having to spend so much time with her very boring friends with some very boring scenes. So there's significant room for improvement. The narrative really needed to be tidied up quite a lot. And then I didn't like any of the characters at all. Her mother is just horrendous, but that's kind of the point. We are trying to see that her mother is not necessarily prioritizing things properly, but can we blame her because she's in this impossible situation? So she's unlikable, but it's also kind of understandable. Paul, I didn't like. He's actually campaigning with the removal of Terry's feeding tube, campaigning against it, but that's how he comes into it, and that's how that part of the story comes into it. But there were so many other ways that Paul could have been introduced without relying on the story with Terry Schiavi. And either they could have done a better job of explaining that story and making it more relevant, because otherwise it's just background fluff, and that's far too serious an event to be background fluff. So I just think it was terribly handled. But there were other ways to bring Paul into this, because he had recently lost somebody. Well, I say recently, I'm not entirely sure how long ago it was, but he has lost somebody. There were ways to connect him with Doris in that way. So again, significant areas of improvement, but very easy ways to make those improvements. So we have unlikable characters, the message or the messages, the topic, the sensitive topic, all of those were handled very well. But there is so much fluff and padding. The narrative structure isn't great. The pacing isn't brilliant. And it's nowhere near as emotional as it could have been, because we don't get the chance to sit with those emotions. We are immediately pulled away from them to go to some stupid party with some boring characters. So it's not amazing. I think the concept is brilliant. And if you can sit through the boring scenes, the many boring scenes, to get to the more moving, important moments, then I'd say it's worth it. But in general, unless you're maybe a teenager, and as I said, if a teenager wants to tell me, actually, this is fabulous, then fair enough, I'm willing to accept that. But if you're older, then I feel like you're going to find the other scenes exceptionally tedious, and the characters are tedious, and the fluff is boring. So there are ways to have made this a better film. Unfortunately, they didn't do that. But in general, the overall concept is very good. And I think it raises some interesting topics for discussion. Do I recommend it? I have absolutely no idea. I genuinely don't have any idea whether I recommend this or not. I think it's not a good film in general, but I think the important parts are very well done. So I don't know what to do with that information. Make up your own mind with this one, because I can't decide whether I recommend it or not. If it sounds like it would appeal to you, give it a go. But personally, I'm not impressed with it. It had a lot of potential. Clearly, it was an important project for the director since it's semi-autobiographical. I totally understand that. But that doesn't mean that for me as a viewer, it's going to be a valuable experience. There is value in it, but not from start to finish. It needs a lot of work to be a great film. But the potential was certainly there.